Welcome back, peeps. My name is Chad Wilson from Simple Cloudware, and today we are going to be using a JWT token in a Visual Studio Angular Core project. Keep your head in the clouds. Alright, let's get started here. So, of course, we're going to start by adding our models because it is the first thing that we end up using. So we're going to create a Boolean model here. All right. We're just going to add the value. And it's just going to be a simple response getter setter. And then also here, just as a general pattern, we're going to be using the JSON property. And where this comes into handy is many times when you're dealing with the mapping of JSON to C# objects, the casing is different or the full-on name will be different. So this gives us the opportunity to do an auto mapping for that. All right, and then we're going to create our token. And here you'll be able to see the JSON property at work. I think in the other one, since they were the same, you don't necessarily need it, but it's just a good habit, especially when you know that you're going to be working back and forth with JSON models and C# models. This way you can keep your naming conventions appropriate for the particular code that you're using. And naming conventions are one of those things that they're just highly opinionated, so you want to make sure to get it right. All right. And you'll see also when you're dealing with older systems or APIs that you're logging into or using, they will have a completely different naming convention that doesn't even fit the normal JavaScript pattern or C# pattern. And this is kind of an example of that, where it's just underscore all lowercase, which is not the norm. And another thing that you want to be super careful with is when you're dealing with any of these naming conventions, it's so easy to get tripped up on just a character out of place. So I try to be very careful, and many times just even typing these in, I will make sometimes spelling mistakes and sometimes just leaving off a pluralization or something, and it just kills me when I go to start to run the program. So just be careful. All right. And we're just following the same pattern here, creating the JSON property. And then to auto add the using statements, that's just a control period. Okay, So now we're set, and let's jump into the code. And we're gonna cut and paste a particular class or function that we know is working. However, the one thing that you want to remember when you're cutting and pasting, you have to be very careful to the subtle differences. Otherwise, there won't be any errors, but it won't be appropriate code. So we're replacing the models here. And then once again, super careful on the calls and the strings. And here we're going to add our secret. Which now that we have the need for the secret, we're going to need to also add that to the configurations. That's another thing I like to knock out as soon as possible, is putting in the models and the configurations, because those are things that you need almost immediately. So let's add that up here as a private string. Being careful to watch our spelling. And then let's add this over here to our app settings. And in the link below, you can click that to get your own secret. And that way we won't be stepping on each other through these particular tutorials. You can just put in your email address, and the system will send you a secret that you can use for following along with any of these projects. And just make sure everything is looking good. See, and I fixed that error with the parameter name. Okay, looks good. So let's take this and kind of go up the stack, putting it into the interface, and then moving it from the interface to the controller. Give ourselves a little bit of room here. And then let's carefully graph this into our cut and pasted code. All right, looks good. And then let's just get this example code out of here. Okay, so now that we have the API set up, let's go over to the Angular part of our application and write the code that's going to connect to our API. So the API is written in C#, and then the front end is written in Angular. Two different patterns, two different histories, and so when we hop back and forth in between these two platforms, we want to make sure to follow the norms of each platform and not combine, something that's similar in C# with something that works the same but might be styled differently in Angular. So you just kind of want to respect its history. So here we're going to add a component. And if you don't have this component section, there's a link below that you can install this template. And one thing, you want to keep the pattern the same, so we're going to set this to CSS and not have a test file. That way the whole project has the same type of CSS and without the test. And then as soon as we add that, we want to make sure to put it into the module. Without it, it won't work. So come in here and then be, once again, very careful on our naming convention. Okay, good. Picked it up. And then let's add that to our declarations and to our navigation. And this is actually the route we'll add to the navigation next. And we'll just take our time to make sure that we have all the pieces in correctly. Okay, looks good. So now let's add it to our new component, and we're just going to grab code that actually works. And then let's add a parameter that we can load this information into. And there really isn't any need to put the public there. You can if you want. If it isn't noted, then it's automatically seen as public. So we're just going to do a string here in which we can load this data and then demonstrate it in the UI. So bring that in here, and then make sure we have our model correct, and then our call. And then we're just going to bring in these imports. So I'll just copy those in. All right, let's see what's up here. Okay, so let's add this model. I'm breaking my own tradition of add the models and the configurations up front so you don't have to deal with it later. We're going to get this together. And let's just call it a token model. And in my naming conventions, I try to be as specific as reasonable, because software is created, but the majority of the time you're dealing with it, you're maintaining it. So the more clear you can be without overdoing it, the better. So I'll just call this a token model. All right, looks good. And now let's add the model for our Boolean responses. So we get all of our models in. And that way we won't have to kind of break out of coding in the particular component. All right. So let's go back to our component here, and then we'll get our naming convention correct. All right, that piece looks good. So let's deal with our base and our HTTP, which is in the constructor. All right. Everything looks good. And then we're replacing the, let's see here. Oh, yep, we need to add the inject. Probably the next controller, we'll just copy all the imports in. And let's not forget to put this into the interface using the double brackets. That way we'll have a visual of our logging in. And now let's add our new control to the navigation. Perfect. And let's give it a shot. See if we can get this thing to go. Ah, the suspense. Okay, loading, that's a good sign. And usually let's do our API test just to make sure that we have connectivity. And step-by-step build ourselves up to each call. And there we go, we've got a token. So we're looking good. So we'll stop this. So now that we have the token, let's move on. And we're going to test this token. And let's be as careful as possible with our cut and paste job. This is always the source of bugs, so let's just try to be as careful as possible. And this is going to be the second step in our process. So we've already gotten the token, and then now we're going to use this token and create a test to make sure that our tokens are working appropriately. Then we copy it up to the interface. And then into the controller. So you see this similar pattern that we repeat when we're dealing with connectivity. And I try to be as routine as possible. It really helps not only when I come back, there's a similar pattern, but in troubleshooting and also just giving me the capacity to do things quicker. All right, and here's where our token will be. And we're going to actually pass in the token from the query string, and that's what the from query means, is it will auto map it in from the query parameters that we're going to create in Angular. So it's a pretty cool function how it just auto maps it for you. Okay, so now let's create our component to test our token. So we're going to follow our same naming convention, CSS, no test file, so all of our components look similar. All right, here we go. And of course, now going down to the module, same routine, add the component. Make sure to be extra careful as we're typing these in. All right. Add it to the declarations, add it to the router, looks good. Now let's add to the navigation. All right, and our token test. Okay, and let's carefully cut and paste in our imports. And everything. Let's just even bring in the constructor. All right, and now let's make sure we're very careful in replacing all the particular unique items. All right, let's start at the top with the models. All right, one thing that we want to do here is, so we can get a little bit of a reuse, is let's break out these calls into a data service. And we're going to create a TypeScript file. And this is going to kind of work us into the next level of thinking when it comes to making these calls, is instead of making the calls directly from a component, which means that you might get duplicate code, is let's break out the calls into a data service and then inject that service into the components. So we have one place where the API calls live. So we're going to make this injectable. We're going to add in our HTTP client. And we're just going to bring in those calls that we made from the component here, which is going to prep us for using a switch statement, which gives us the ability to make a call, get the token, and then after that is successful, then call the test. So it's kind of a two-step process, which is very common when it comes to making a call to an API. Alright, so let's create the class. Data services. I usually try to make this plural as a pattern. And then we're going to make this injectable. Then we're going to bring in the HTTP client. And this is going to be the same call that we made from the controller. We're just going to bring it over here so we can have two or multiple components call the same thing. All right. Forgot the parens on the ejectable, so I got that in there now. And once again, be super careful when it comes to creating these strings. I always do a double check to make sure I have it right. And as you can see here, it is subtly different, so. It's always good to recheck these. There we go. And then we're just going to use a simple get, and then we're going to add the URL. Oops, let's actually first add the model. All right, looks good. And here we're going to make our second call. And we'll be passing the base URL and the token in here. And copy both of these. Once again, let's be careful with our strings. And we're going to be using the simple Boolean response here. So we're doing pretty good on the cut and paste. And now let's add our data services to our module. All right, data services. And let's bring this into our providers. All right. So now we're going to use the data services instead of just making the call directly. And then here is really the most important part is the switch map. And this gives us the ability to make a call and await the call to return with the token to then use the token in the second call. So we got our result. And then we'll use this result boolean to verify the token. And here we'll add in our data services. All right, so we're calling the data services. And the first call we're going to be making is to the token. And remember, it was the base URL. And then we're going to be using the pipe, which is part of the syntax for making a double call with the switch map. And within the switch map, we are going to be consuming the return token we're going to be storing it in session. Very common pattern. And then after we store the token in session, then we'll make the call to test. And we'll return this to the interface just so we have a visual of what's happening here. And then make the call to test to verify the token itself. All right. And the final piece of this, we're going to create the subscribe. Let's just make sure we don't have any spelling errors. We got the data services in there. Let's just look at these particular items and get it cleaned up. Get the auth test. All right, so it looks like everything is good. A couple spelling issues, but nothing big. And then we got the subscribe going, so let's run this and see what we got. Okay, and then we're going to do our initial test. See, it's coming into the code nicely. Run through this. So we know we can get to the API. Now let's try to get a token by itself. Looks good. And then let's get the token and then use the token. Let's see here. And we got nothing. So let's do a little bit of troubleshooting and see if we can figure out why. Let's stop this. And the first thing I do when it isn't working is I go back and look to make sure that I have everything filled out. So in this case, we just didn't add it to the UI, so our little visuals weren't there. Just fine. So we got the visuals going, and let's just check everywhere else. Okay, it looks like here we need to add our parameters. So the one thing that I've forgotten when I first set this up was we need to pass the token itself. So we're over back in the data services. So I created the call, but I forgot to pass the token. So let's get that in there. Okay. That looks good. And we'll put a breakpoint there. And another thing that I missed was this. Get auth is not the appropriate thing, it's just auth test. So two issues. One, we forgot to add the parameters, and two, we didn't have the auth test endpoint correct. We had get auth test instead of just auth test. So now that we have those updated, let's give her a shot and see what we got. So just always the details. Okay, so let's go right to it. can see we're there. The initial call is looking good. Looks like a good URL. Let's continue. Okay, so we came into our second call. We've got the token and the base. Call. That's coming in. Looks good. Okay. Now we're in the C#. There we go. Now we have our OK. So we're just tracing through the code, making sure everything is configured just right. And there we have our true. So now we've created a token, and then we tested the use of that token. Congratulations, peeps! You have now created a JWT token in an Angular core project. Wow, that was a lot of work, and it was totally worth it. Comments, suggestions below. Hit that notification and like button, and remember, keep your head in the cloud.